Welcome to Rates and Barrels. It's Wednesday, October 30th. Derek Van Riper, Eno Saris here with you on this episode. We get you caught up on a few things that happened in Game 4 of the World Series. The Yankees got on the board. The offense woke up. We'll dig into a few possible longer-term implications connecting to Game 4. Of course, many of you will hear this episode as that game is beginning or after it has started. So we have a lot of other things we're going to talk about, including Will Venable going to the White Sox to be their new manager. We'll talk about the other offseason moves that might be on tap for a club that is deep into a rebuild. We're also going to take a look at some over and underperformers, looking back at the full season projections for hitters, players that went way under, that disappointed us, players that went way over, that surprised us, try to figure out what is next for several of those players. If you'd like to join our Discord, you can do that with the link in the show description. Be sure to do that. We'll have a chat going again during Game 5 on Wednesday night. Let's begin with a few takeaways. The Yankees win Game 4. Freddie Freeman homered again. So it's now 6 consecutive games in the World Series that he has homered. All 4 games of this series, 2 from the previous World Series he played in. That is a major league record. But the story was the Anthony Volpe, right? This was the Anthony Volpe game, the type of game you dream about growing up as a kid, especially as a kid that was a Yankees fan, doing it in front of the home fans, getting your team back on the board, maybe creating a turning point for the entire series in the process.
Yeah, I mean, just an incredible grand slam for Anthony Volpe, incredible game for him, I thought. He was aggressive on the base pass. He knocked a ball loose, sliding into second with his head without his helmet. It was... That was a little bit lucky because the throw beat him, but he was being aggressive and, being everything that a lot of other players on the Yankees can't be. We've talked about this a little bit, that Jazz and him represent youth and energy in a way that you don't expect out of, somebody like Juan Soto. Even though Juan Soto is young, he's not fast. He's not a good defender, So Volpe and Jazz have a little bit more of that, like, ability to bring an all-around game to the table. And, I think there's a few things stand out to me about that pitch. If you looked at the highlight, he threw it to where the catcher set up. So I don't think it was a mistake. It didn't move as much as Hudson's pitches usually do. It had about 2 inches less drop. But I think he was throwing a get me over slider. He was throwing a 0-0 steal a strike slider. And the reason I say that is because the league swung at 30% of first pitches this year, which is too low, I think. There's a lot of fastballs on first pitches that you don't see again. Anthony Volpe swung at first pitches 20% of the time.
Wow.
And in the playoffs, Anthony Volpe has been even more or even less aggressive. And we've seen his walk rate kind of soar in the playoffs. So I think Dan Hudson and his catcher were thinking, this is going to be a strike one. And the reason he sets up on the inside for that slider is he doesn't want to set up on the outside and have the slider miss on the outside. This is a steal your strike. And we know that throwing sliders, to the arm side as opposed to the glove side sometimes changes their movement. And I think the reaction from Hudson was so immediate. Just as soon as he saw, like, he didn't even turn around or anything. Like, he was immediately started screaming into the ground. And I think that's partially because maybe he just knew from the sound of the contact. A lot of times you can just know. But also the fact that Volpe swung.
Mm-hmm.
If you throw it and you see him swinging, you're like, oh, crap. Like, already that's not what we wanted. So I think there's something going on there. What I take away from the hitter side is just, I think it's Anthony Volpe is just a really fascinating case for next year. There's people who have watched him all year in New York that have sort of declared that he's a 0 at the plate. It's now 1,290 plate appearances with an 84 WRC plus during the regular season. Most even defenders of Anthony Volpe in the Yankees Twitter sphere seem to lead with his defense and say he's a fine player, but he's no he's no offensive, middle of the lineup bat, and he's just going to be there for defense while he's young or whatever. And I don't know. I think that we've talked about this a little bit, but I think there's enough of a toggle where I think there's two different Anthony Volpes in there, two different swings he's shown in 2023 and 24, that if he can put them together and this postseason, I think he's showing that he can. And I think there's another level. So, in his first year, he had a 41% ground ball rate, lifted the ball well, 9% barrel rate, 174 ISO, 28% strikeout rate. He comes back the next year, he lets the ball travel. His pull rate goes from 46% to 32%. His barrel rate goes from 9 to 3.9. His strikeout rate goes from 27.8 to 22.6. So, and his ISO goes from 174 to 121. So Anthony Volpe, sacrificed, for contact, let the ball travel. On that pitch that he hit the grand slam, he was un-Volpean.
Well, he showed us something that he wasn't doing for most of this year, but that he's been able to do in the past. And I think there might not be in baseball, there may not be a more difficult situation to be in than to be an elite prospect at shortstop in the Yankees organization, and then add the complication of growing up in the area too.
Growing up and
right.
All that.
So not only do you have the constant comparisons to Jeter, like automatically from growing up, having watched him and all that, like you also grew up in the era of prospects getting more attention than ever. So this would have been hard 20 years ago, but it's even harder today.
People were watching your perfect game at bats.
Heck yeah, they were. So think about this for a second. Jeter broke in. He was a rookie in 1995, only played 15 games. First 2 full seasons, though. He was 22 and 23 years old. This was in 96 and 97. And he was a very good player right away. A 106 WRC plus and a 110. Better than the 80s we're seeing from Volpe right now. I think you and I would agree, and maybe many of our listeners would agree, that it was a little easier to break into the league in the 90s than it is right now. The quality of stuff that you see is just off the charts.
I think also things like scouting reports. I think a lot of times when a rookie came up, they're like, okay, throw him low and away until he proves he can do something there, and then we'll have a book on him eventually. And now it's like, no, we have StatCast in AAA. Like, we know where all his hot zones are. We've got a whole scouting report, on this rookie from day one.
Right. And I'm not trying to besmirch the quality of baseball in the 90s. I'm just saying it's more difficult now because of all of these other factors. And if we consider that, then we have to be more patient. And even then, if you look at Jeter's first 2 years, you say, okay, 106, 110, those first 2 full seasons, he found the next gear in year 3. It was a 128 WRC plus, a 156, and a 133 in years 3, 4, and 5. So even for a player that good in that era, to get to the peak sort of level, it took some time. Volpe's been young for the level everywhere he's played. The glove keeps him in the lineup every single day. We talk all the time about the benefits you get as a hitter when your playing time is not going up and down. Volpe's got that part locked in. So yeah, I could see where you want to like Frankenstein some of the approach things he's done, put it all together and say, yeah, of course there's one more level there. And I would agree with that just based on the benefits of more time and experience in the big leagues. I don't know if it's superstar, 30-30 type ceiling, but I think you can get average power and speed all at once. I think he has shown us enough to believe that Anthony Volpe has a ceiling like that. Whether the comps to Jeter ever go away and whether the expectations are always unfair, I have no idea. I assume that expectations and comps will always be unfair. Like you, I'm interested for next year. The price right now, we now have 8 early drafts in the books. Pick 136 is the average wide range. Pick 97 to 169 within there. It's about a round earlier than where I think he was this time last year. If he continues to play well as this series goes on, recency bias is real strong earlier. In the playoffs. Yeah.
After the year he had.
Yeah, I think he was about 150 this time last year, maybe crept up a little bit. I remember Volpe versus Trevor Story, I think, was the toss-up in this range.
What is this toss-up now when near's average spot?
Volpe versus Bo Bichette, if we're looking shortstop to shortstop. Volpe versus Matt McClain. If we're looking middle infielders, McClain goes a tad earlier. Like
McClain just went tank in the AFL yesterday.
Yeah, playing a little outfield out there too. I think it's a reasonable price. I think there's still the possibility that Volpe could end up higher in the order in the long run, and that he doesn't necessarily have to move up a lot to continue.
He's not
to be
a
valuable.
slam dunk for me there, though. I think I might take Bo over him.
Okay, but a reasonable price. You're interested for next year.
I think what I'm interested in is being in that league where he drops to 160, 170, and kind of being like, oh, he's Bo's been gone, I'd take him over Matt McClain because Matt McClain's coming off a shoulder injury, and we're not exactly sure what Matt McClain's true talent power is either.
Right. There's a lot of questions about McClain. I think just simply playing in the fall league bodes really well for his chances of then having what we call a normal offseason once he gets to that point, right? Getting some reps in now is a good sign. All of this is to say, I think you have to invent time travel if you want to get Volpe at that discount, that late price. I think it's only going to tick up from here based on a lot of the things we've talked about. A couple other takeaways, though, from this game. I wonder if just feeling like that pressure is off changes anything once we get to game 5. We'll have an episode coming out on Thursday where we kind of take a look, either the Dodgers winning the series or the series going back to LA based on the outcome. But it did feel like getting on the board with a couple of really big innings. They put 5 on in the 8th inning as well, which ended up carrying over to maybe give Luke Weaver some rest. If that game stays close, I think Luke Weaver keeps going. And then the impact on game 5 is that if Weaver comes back, he's not available for as many outs, or he's just simply more tired. So the Gleyber Torres insurance runs were
a
big.
Third time too. So
yeah. So I wonder if that's going to be an important carryover for game 5 and beyond.
That was definitely, something that we had Tommy Pham on the live blog, and, on his sign out, he said, Yanks did what they had to do, but Dodgers have a lot of arms saved in the pen. Yanks going to need Cole to go deep in order to win, and Dodgers have seen the Yanks bullpen too much. That's a real thing in a 7-game series. So just a player sort of giving some validity to what we've been talking about with relievers. I think that there was something to Volpe and Austin Wells doing well in this, which is, takes a little bit of the pressure off of themselves, shows that the bottom of the lineup can do something. And I don't know, this is a little bit of vibes reporting, but, Aaron Judge did take a walk and got a hit. I thought he looked a lot better in the game. Judge did. Yeah. I think that he was just like, okay, I don't need to expand the zone and try to hit a home run to win this game. It'd be useful for my team if I take a walk instead of striking out. So he seemed to spit on a lot more sliders down and didn't seem as jumpy and seemed a little bit more calm at the plate. I don't know what that's going to mean. It could all be done tonight. But if Judge goes on a heater, that can change things a little bit, especially since I don't think Shohei looks right. I don't think that I don't think that I feel like you can see him grimacing. In the first game, not last night, in Monday's game, he was like literally running off the field holding his shoulder after at-bats.
Yeah,
it looks like maybe it's really a little bit better, but yeah.
So everybody that started for the Yankees in game 4, other than Rizzo, had a hard hit ball. So it did feel like, aside from 11 runs on the scoreboard, that a lot of guys found something if they didn't previously have anything going. A little bit of momentum could go.
But it was also very definitively the Dodgers B team in terms of pitching.
They did a great job not using anyone that they care about. I mean, like in a human way, I'm sure they care about Landon Knack and Brent Honeywell. Maybe not, though. They let Honeywell throw 50 pitches in one inning. So maybe that's up for some debate. But it was Kasparius 2, Hudson for 1, Knack for 4, Honeywell for 1, which keeps their A bullpen, with the exception of Hudson, as fresh as you could want in game 5. And you got Flaherty, so you don't necessarily go in expecting to use every single one of your A relievers. There's a chance Flaherty pitches well again, and you only have to use 3 of those guys. So I think that does bode well, especially on the other side. They chase Heel after 4. The Yankees had to throw Tim Hill. They had to throw Clay Holmes. They had to throw Mark Leiter Jr. They had to throw Weaver, 21 pitches, so not as bad as it could have been. And then they finally got to someone they're not going to use again unless they have to, in Tim Mesa. So that was the silver lining for me, kind of looking at it from the Dodgers perspective, is we preserved a lot of our arms. The Yankees had to use a bunch of guys that they like to use when they're protecting leads.
Maybe this will be the it's not the Red Sox, but this could be maybe the karmic comeuppance for losing to the Red Sox in the being down 3-0 before. Maybe they have it in them. The nice part is they have Garrett Cole going. I have a feeling that, Jack Flaherty's not going to have the 94 as often this time, with more regular rest, and that the team will have seen him, and they'll have a better chance at him. He has fewer good pitches than Garrett Cole, so Garrett Cole has different ways he can go. He could throw a bunch of changeups, He has different places he can go in the zone with good command and good power. So I give the Yankees a pitching advantage in this one, and I think I give them the advantage to win this game. So
yeah, might have some baseball in LA while we go to first pitch Arizona this weekend, which 24 hours ago felt like it might have been a little bit of a stretch. Beyond the World Series, how about this? The White Sox getting on the board with some news in October. I mean, it's hiring a manager. It's going to be Will Venable taking over, which, from a tactics perspective and all that, I don't know if there's a whole lot for us to dig into there, but it, to me, opens the door for a little deep dive into a rebuilding team going into an offseason, talking about lowering payroll, having a lot of holes in the depth chart, needing to do a few things in free agency just to fill actual spots, just to make sure you've got enough guys on the roster, and then asking questions like, who wants to sign on for year 2 of a pretty big rebuild? Like, what types of free agents are you even able to bring in? Like, Will Venable, hopefully for the sake of the White Sox, is their right long-term fit, hopefully a great fit for some of the young players that are going to be coming up. But I imagine we're going to see a lot of Colson Montgomery in Chicago this year, right? There's no reason not to at this point. Maybe even for opening day in 2025 with a great spring. I think that's a possibility. But trying to figure out how they patch up the current holes before other prospects are ready, that to me is a really big question. They did pretty well last offseason, bringing Eric Fetty in. Probably some questions still about the returns they got at the trade deadline and the deal that sent Fetty to the Cardinals and Kopech over to the Dodgers. But nevertheless, what do you think the rest of the offseason looks like now that the White Sox have a new manager in place?
I think they're just kind of trying to be a little bit opportunistic and identify. I do think that there's a chance that they've got some okay processes in place for pitching. I respect Brian Bannister, and I respect Ethan Katz. And one thing I'd heard was that part of the managerial search, prospective managers were told that they couldn't necessarily hire their own pitching coach. So I kind of assume that Katz and Bannister are in place and that the team kind of feels good about that, And so I would expect them to maybe bring somebody back from Japan or look at a bounce back guy, or maybe even, be there as a pillow for Giolito if nobody else is, come back. We'll give you a year and an option, or just a year, and we hope to trade you away for a prospect if you're pitching well, that sort of deal, So they'll just be opportunistic, and I expect them to lose a lot of games next year. Will Venable's accolades are, first of all, just an outstanding athlete that, was a Princeton basketball player, and also drafted in the 15th round for baseball, played pretty well in San Diego, was kind of ended up being a little bit of a tweener where not maybe exactly enough glove for center and maybe not enough bat for a corner. So that's why his career ended, but as a player. But he's also the son of Max Venable, who is baseball royalty. And so he's been around baseball his whole entire life. And I've always found him a really good interview, a guy who and this is good because he worked alongside Bochy, since 2022. He gives me the same vibes as Bochy, where he's chill. He's chill. He's on top of his stuff, and he knows so much about baseball, but he's not in your face. And I don't know about his sort of analytical bona fides, but I do think that working with the Red Sox, working with the Cubs, working with the Rangers, he's probably picked up a lot of that alongside of the way. I mean, working alongside Alex Cora and Bruce Bochy, I think, is a good way to learn on the fly and learn from good people. So I think that they're just trying to make sure that they're a representative team next year. They'll buy some cheap free agents and then try to turn them around into something new, but not let them block anybody. So yeah, Colson Montgomery, if he has a good spring, I think he could just break camp with the team. That's part of why he's at the AFL, I think. And then with Venable, just try to bring some everyday calmness and professionalism to the job.
Yeah, and we'll see if they end up trading Luis Robert or not. I mean, I've made the case that maybe they should consider it, even though Robert's coming off of a down year. But if Robert's still there, there's a surprising second half performance from Andrew Benintendi, who had a 133 WRC plus, the same number of homers as Marcell Ozuna in the second half, 13. He was 52nd among hitters in the player rater, 15 team 5x5s.
He always had that raw power in him. I mean, he said barrel rates as high as 9%. And I don't know, he for some reason did this on purpose, where he was like, I'm going to make more contact and not hit the ball hard, which is a hell of a decision to make. I think that it's totally possible that he went to Tread or Driveline or some, he had his own hitting coach, but hopefully that there's something in there that the hitting coaching itself in Chicago has improved, and they said, hey, it might be good to hit the ball hard.
I hope that's intuitive for play for everyone. But well, it's not that players wouldn't want to hit the ball hard. It's they would be trying to do something else and going so far in that direction that it's costing them the quality.
Yeah, I mean, he went from 40% pull rates when he had power to 30% pull rates when he had no power to back to 45% pull rates. So, on a very basic level, there's a sort of push and pull. There's a let it travel or go get it. And, we found a while back that hitting coaches, they had the most impact on swing decisions. And that was a set of research. I think it came from Baseball Prospectus and Russell Carlton. It was like, the biggest impact that a new hitting coach can have is on swing decisions, on whether or not they swing more or swing less. And I have a feeling that if we re-rack that and thought about point of contact, that we could find a similar coaching effect for point of contact. In fact, when I was hanging out at Driveline with Jack Lambert, who works there, I forget his role there, but he's the one who came up with Arsenal Plus. We've talked about his work before. Jack was saying that he thought that one of the things that you can coach best out of a hitter is point of contact and attack angle. So swinging down on the ball and getting that ball or letting that ball travel. So, this seems to be something that you could perhaps affect with coaching. Be like, hey, you were letting the ball travel, but it really sapped all your power. Let's at least be selectively aggressive this year and try to hit a few homers.
Yeah, and maybe that's the story. But I was surprised that he was that productive in the second half. And when I start to think about the types of players that any rebuilding team can get, I think about guys that are maybe caught in between starting and relieving. Spencer Turnbull as a free agent, because what you can offer to a major league free agent at this stage is a clear runway to playing time. If your long-term goal is to get a multi-year deal as a starter and contending teams see you as more of a swingman in-between guy, maybe that's where 1 year, $8 million, whatever it is, ends up getting you to go to the White Sox, because you're signing on to get traded to a contender midseason, but you're getting 4 months to prove that you are actually a number 3 or number 4 starter and not a swing man or not a setup guy, right? Like those types of guys.
Like what Tommy Pham did last year, you know?
Right. Or in the case of, bats, like think about guys that are arbitration eligible to get non-tendered that are good players. Those guys might be looking for everyday roles instead of semi-regular roles. The White Sox can offer that. So I think that's the sort of bin. Once we get through the November transactions, 40-man rosters have to be set before the Rule 5 draft. There's always a crunch, the non-tender deadline, all that stuff. That's probably going to open up a few players that actually make sense for the White Sox and other rebuilding teams that are looking for guys that are good trade pieces, but also not necessarily looking at the guys that are going to be on the radar of a lot of contenders.
Yeah, MLB has some projected arbitration salaries up, and it's kind of hard just like looking through it. But if a team especially if a team like the Angels made a poor decision on Joe Adele or something, a young player like that. But I think even some older players that like the Athletics, will they pay Miguel Andujar $3 million next year? As they're projected to. Seth Brown, $4 million. Those are pretty limited players, and they may have a better replacement for cheaper. That's the type of player that I think will end up in Chicago.
Yeah. So we'll see what they're able to do over the course of the offseason. I don't think it changes a lot about where they finish in the standings, but it does help them long term if they can identify a few free agents, flip them later in the season, help those players boost their own value along the way. I think that's the role you have in the league right now, White Sox. Not as fun for fans, but hopefully they're at least active in that corner of the player pool. Let's take a look at some players that missed their projections this year. We are going to first take a look at hitters who underperformed. So we took a look at the Bat X, then we looked at the results for this season. And I think what you find in the underperformers, at least the group of largest underperformers, we're focusing on players that had at least 250 plate appearances because that at least gives us a decent snapshot, and likely these players were expected to be regulars even if injuries prevented them from reaching that level. You were going to find guys that dealt with injuries in many, many cases. The more fascinating ones are guys that were not hurt and we're just kind of like, oh, they fell off a cliff. Why? Why did they fall off that cliff? So I recall that we were pretty excited about Chas McCormick coming into the season. And of all the players that I see near the bottom of this list, Chas McCormick looked really safe to me. The projection was for a 103 WRC plus. We thought there was some power, some speed, nice stable floor of playing time. We thought that the departure of Dusty Baker was also a good thing because it seemed like that might even stabilize McCormick's role in the everyday lineup. Well, it turns out the Chas McCormick in and out of the lineup stuff goes beyond Dusty Baker. It was a 66 WRC plus, a 211 average, only 5 homers and 8 stolen bases over 267 plate appearances. What do you think went so wrong for Chas McCormick as a guy that we thought around that pick 150, 175 range was going to be a really solid outfielder with some growth potential?
It's not injury, but there is something similar to this about injury. And he did have, a couple of injuries that hurt him along the way. But, I think that the story here is his defense was maybe not as good as we thought. Because they preferred Jake Myers' defense in center field. It's not like Jake Myers had a great year offensively, that really just pushed Chas out of the way in terms of offense. Jake Myers had an 86 WRC plus this year. But he was the better defender, and his shoulder was healthy, and they wanted to see what he could do. So I think some part of this is, really analyzing the depth charts well and realizing that his hold on center field was not as strong as we thought. And then what happens is if you're not an everyday player, you start to have these issues where you can't get going. You're in for a couple games and then you're out for a couple games. And that's what I saw with Chas. I was afraid it was happening with Cedric Mullins. I guess Cedric Mullins' defense was good enough to keep him in there long enough to finally get that hot streak and, prop the numbers up. And I guess Chas McCormick's defense was not good enough to keep him in the lineup to get to that hot streak because a lot of the same skills underlying are still there. And at the very least, he should have been able to go to the hitter that went oppo, 14, 15 times a year and, hit 250 and got on base. He should have been able to go back to where he was in 2022 at the very least. And I think he just didn't get the opportunity to because his defense wasn't keeping him in the games. The team wanted to win games. Remember, the team had to win games. They started out really poorly. So they had a lot of stress on them, and they weren't going to, just let Chas McCormick be out there and try to win games with the rest of the players. They had to try everything they could. In any case, I think this is a depth chart thing. You have to be really careful about understanding the player's defense when you're projecting playing time, because that's going to be an underlying factor, and it could play out really poorly as it did for Chas McCormick this year.
And we had a couple other guys that were similar. I mean, I know Jack Sawinski was a player you really liked coming into the season too. Very similar projection, similarly missed. I mean, I think I may have done the same kind of thing where I thought there was more defensive value with Sawinski that stabilized his playing time. And I think part of what kept us hanging on in season was the K rate came down. So we kept thinking, okay, he's not striking out as much. This is just a prolonged slump, but more must have been going on there. I think the thing that is still intriguing to me about Jack Sawinski, he's still just 26. It's not like impossible. And maybe he's the kind of guy that with a change of scenery ends up on a different team, ends up with the White Sox and has less pressure on his playing time for a year and starts to put the pieces together. So similar to the Lars Newbar question from yesterday, but at a much lower price, do you still think there's enough there where Sawinski could find his way back into a large share of playing time, at least as large as he had in 2023 when he got to 534 plate appearances?
I do, actually. And I think that these guys, all of the outfielders that we've talked about today, are interesting to me in draft and holds and in dynasty leagues where, you might be able to get them cheap and then they just recover from that blip and get back to where they'd been before. They're deeper league things. I think these aren't necessarily 12-team situations, but they could become relevant again. They are names that you shouldn't just cross off and decide that they're never going to be good again. And they each have like different pathways back to relevancy, and they also speak to how deep the outfielder pool is. Because I think there are more players like this that you could see becoming at least a 2/3 outfielder, 2/3 playing time outfielder during the course of the season without, major, this guy has to get hurt and this guy has to get hurt and this guy, you know what I mean? Like, no, they just have to play to where they were a year ago and they'll find playing time even on the same team that they're on. And so I think there's more people like that in the outfielder situation than there are. It's like, how many shortstops can you say, he didn't have a good year, but he might play his way into being the starting shortstop this year?
Yeah, that position just doesn't work that way, generally speaking. The corners tend to play more like that. Like first base, left field, right field all seem to be more like that. Second base sometimes can play your way into it, but you're right. The center field, shortstop, catcher, those tend to be more balanced, like as far as how the opportunities are distributed. You can't really just slug your way into a spot at those positions.
Sawinski, for me, does represent the risk that you have with strikeout rates. And I think you see with Chas McCormick, Dylan Carlson, Nolan Jones, Edouard Julien, Adam Duvall, Luis Robert, Davis Schneider, Michael A. Taylor, Kevin Kiermaier, Jack Sawinski, Javier Baez, like
Brian De La Cruz is in here.
Brian De La Cruz,
like a bunch of dudes on here that have high K rates.
I just listed more than half of the worst underperformers this year.
Yeah,
and they all had bad K rates.
Yeah, and regardless of injury status, I do think that's of the basic skills you can find of players that underperform that would lead you to not see buy low. I think that's probably the biggest red flag for most of these guys.
And I think that it does a couple things, like the way we were talking about Chas McCormick and like how he just didn't get enough sample to get back online like Mullins did or whatever. Strikeout rate does that to you because it lets you have fewer lottery tickets in play. And so you can actually just have a season where you have like a 230 BABIP and you just didn't put enough balls in play. You had like 400 plate appearances with a 33% strikeout rate. You just didn't have enough plate appearances to actually get to where we know your true talent BABIP. You know, you just didn't put enough balls out there for us to really know how good you are there. So most of those guys with the high strikeout rates and underperforming, especially if they're of a certain age, play their way off of any sort of sleeper list that I have. I think of the names that I mentioned that I would be interested still next year is Luis Robert. Still the right age, still the right defensive ability to play every day, still the right combination of power and speed to make himself interesting. And then the names that, I have sort of circled among those guys that bother me and that I'm not exactly sure, and maybe we have to spend some more time investigating them, is Edouard Julien and Nolan Jones, where there's good patience, bad contact ability. Julien has some platoon issues. Both teams have shown reticence sometimes in the past to play people every day when you kind of think they should.
Yep.
So I kind of have the shrug emoji when it comes to Julien and Jones right now. I'm actually kind of interested this weekend to hear people's opinions on those two players. I think they're kind of fascinating. They're among the most fascinating names at the bottom of this list.
I think if you said you have to buy low on a player with a 30% K rate who's had a 30% K rate before, which Luis Robert has not, I think Nolan Jones is actually higher on my list of guys I'd believe in because his back was messed up for most of last season. Like I think it's multiple stints on the IL with the back. Yeah. I think with the retirement of Charlie Blackmon especially, you're going to see plenty of Nolan Jones so long as he's healthy this year. I think because he does everything that you want StatCast wise, I think that will matter to the Rockies enough to say, let's just see what we have if he's healthy, and they'll give him another shot at 500 plus plate appearances. Now, maybe even with health, he was going to underperform relative to the 30-30 pace he was on the year before. That may have been a level he couldn't sustain over a full season. But I think about how excited some people were about Jones going into last season. The discount you're going to get now seems pretty steep. So as long as there's no sort of lingering concerns about that back throughout the winter, I could see myself having some Nolan Jones on a bunch of teams. It's outside the top 200 by ADP right now with a pretty wide spread. There's a lot of things he does well. So if you're drafting him hoping for 230, 240, 2020, you don't need more than that at that price. There's a good chance you can get more than that because the opportunity should be there for him to play a lot. So he's on the short list of high strikeout guys that I would like as a possible bounce back target.
Yeah, as someone who's dealing with a little something in my back right now, I feel like backs are an interesting thing because, it turns out that was a big part of why Brian Hayes was no good this year.
Right. I think Brian Hayes is easily like a big injury. Like we don't even know if he took a step forward this year because he was so hurt.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of people who are just going to write him off completely. And to be fair, I don't know if he's a top 12 third baseman, but we traded George Springer for him in the 20-team dynasty.
I think Devils Rejects. I think it's a good move.
And we were happy to hear about the back injury. Like I know that's screwed up. That's how fantasy players' brains work. But we're just happy. You can be happy for the player too, because it's like, okay, then fix that, and come back.
Right. It's a satisfactory explanation for the breakout that you thought you saw at the end of the previous season not happening. Mm-hmm. And as long as it's not a major long-term problem, then you can still believe that what we started to see at the end of 2023 is out there for Brian Hayes. What do you do for the players who are not strikeout machines that significantly underperform their projections? So I would say Keibert Ruiz would probably be the guy that's jumping off the page to me a little bit. Michael Garcia fits into this group. Andres Jimenez also fits into this group. What do you think about guys like that as possible rebound candidates, and how do you explain their wide misses compared to their projections?
I mean, it's usually that we just didn't see the power we expected. I mean, Michael Garcia, 101 ISO, Andres Jimenez, 0.087 ISO. I mean, you even have Tyler Freeman on this list right next to them with a 112 ISO. It's where it's that Starlin Castro problem that I was talking about with Luis Garcia Jr., where when somebody hasn't demonstrated power, but you're kind of searching for it on the player page. You know what I mean? I'm calling up Andres Jimenez's player page right now because he has hit 17 homers in there. And you could say, oh, well, he had 110 max EV in 2021 and he had a 6% barrel rate in 2022. It's non-zero power, but you can do that with Michael Garcia's max EV, and you can do it with some of Tyler Freeman's numbers. These guys don't have any power.
I'll push back a little. I think Jimenez has proof of some power in that he hit 17 homers in 2022 and 15 in 2023. The underlying power numbers weren't even great the second time Jimenez got to double digits. He had 15 homers with a 27% hard hit rate and a 5.5% barrel rate. And again, I know it's a lower K rate profile, so those numbers don't always pop, but if he could get back to 12, 15 homers, keep stealing bases, and then just keep playing every day because of his defense, which has been the case, then I'm actually somewhat interested in Andres Jimenez in 2025. And I think I had absolutely no interest in the inflated price that we just had in this past draft season. It's just weird to me how much it fluctuates. So like the interest can shift so heavily.
I get it. The reason I'm being a little bit hyperbolic. Nailed it.
Drilled it. Right down the middle. Striped.
There's a lot of other things I was about to say with that same word. A lot of weird pronunciations that were occurring to me. Anyway, I was sort of pushing it because they do have some power, and that's why we were interested in them. We liked that Michael Garcia hit the ball 110 last year, and so on and so forth, right? But I will say that I do find this package has representation in this part of the player pool. Like this package can underwhelm you. This package will break your heart. So, I don't know who's going to be overdrafted. Like one thing I want to do right now is go to the top of the list and say who at the top of the list showed more power than we expected and may just drop back down. So Victor Robles was the third biggest jump or over projections, right? 126 ISO. He could have a 0.06 ISO. You know what I mean? Like true talent.
Yeah, he definitely could. I've lived it. I've seen it.
Right. So, really deserving, like really having like good power will keep you in the game. So Brent Rooker has no defensive value. He may play in the outfield next year, but he has very little defensive value. He over his skis, number 2 in the big leagues in terms of outperformance projections. But there's a lot more to hang on to sink your teeth into, and to feel like he, worst case scenario, he just hits, 230 next year, but he still hits 32 bombs or whatever. You know what I mean? Like there's just power. Power is like demonstrated real power. Matt Wallner, really over his skis, 36% strikeout rate, not great defensively. I'm still going to prefer that to Victor Robles. I hew towards power. So Jurickson Profar with like a 0.179 ISO, a top 10 overproduction of his what he's done. I think Jurickson Profar you can play the same game with his batted ball stats that you would play with Andres Jimenez and be like, oh, he deserved it. He had a 7% barrel rate. No, for his career, he has a 4% barrel rate. He's going to drop down, and he's an example of where even the playing time could dry up. So I don't mind having small amounts of investment in these types of players where the power is really iffy, but I I want to make sure that I don't buy them in the first 5 to 7 rounds.
That's fair, and that's why I wasn't in on Andres Jimenez last year. Like I saw that. I mean, it also kept me away from CJ Abrams to an extent too. There was a little more interest in Abrams because I thought there was more speed ceiling, and being a little younger, I thought maybe he could get to more power. But that's the player type I don't want early, but I'll gamble on late. And I think your Profar example is exactly the reason why I am interested in Jimenez. There is proof he can hit for some power. If he hits for more than some power, maybe it looks like that, and it's power, speed, and decent average. The benefit of his glove is that it will drive his playing time. So that's where I'm in. Like the Profar, it's different because Profar doesn't run as much, but it's similar in the sense that expectations are very low.
Do you think Garcia benefits from the same? I mean, his defense is good, but it's also a team that's looking for more offense.
I think so. I think he's good enough. 69 WRC plus. That's borderline.
He was losing some playing time down the stretch as they were trying to make the playoffs. That's something I noticed about the lineups. I do think, if they think they can get more offense at third base, I still think his glove puts him in the mix at second base, but I don't think it's a guarantee that he's a starter next year.
He might become a super sub depending on who else they add. You could see Garcia maybe becoming a 3 or 4 position guy. That's not a bad thing for us as long as the playing time is close to every day. But yeah, I think when you dip down that far below league average, then you do leave the door open for your team to replace you if things break a certain way. If the right free agent comes along, the right trade offer comes along, that could shake things up enough. So I don't look at Garcia
defensive numbers
as
weren't elite as Jimenez's either.
Right. See, I don't think he's quite as safe as Jimenez. I think people might be more interested because he's younger, and you could still talk yourself into more paths forward to get better.
I was tempted. I think Jimenez, I forget exactly what my vote was for the overall sort of like platinum glove that the Fielding Bible gave out, like the defensive player of the year. In the end, I think Dalton Varsho won it. But I had Andres Jimenez in the mix for that.
Deservedly so. So a few other names that really popped. You mentioned Rooker before. As far as guys that played every single day or close to it, Rooker was the biggest overperformer on projections. Narrowly missed 40 homers at 39, stole 11 bases, had great run production, and did it while hitting .293. And now in early drafts, Brent Rooker versus Teoscar Hernandez is a draft day decision that you might be thinking about if you're looking for that early thump.
And I think I prefer Rooker's more plate discipline approach. I think Teoscar is, and I've been wrong about this, already. But I think Teoscar is heading towards the point where some of his chase percentage can start leading to more strikeouts.
Yeah, he's a couple years older. He's 32. I do think with Teoscar Hernandez, if he were to re-up with the Dodgers, I'm probably on that side. If he ends up signing with a new team in free agency that's mid-pack or even possibly below in terms of its overall lineup quality, that probably is enough to swing it in favor of Rooker. Like if you neutralize that, then I prefer Rooker. But I think if Hernandez is on a contender, I think the counting stats end up being
I think you
a little
can
more
see
stable.
It even a little bit with like Jorge Soler. He signs with the Giants and he's the only guy, with that kind of power, puts pressure on himself. And I know this is, again, sort of vibes territory, but it's true that, you can't just take a player that was great in a great lineup and just put him in a bad lineup and it's going to be the same. They're going to get pitched harder. They won't have people on base as much, so the defense will get to play the way they want to. They'll walk them more than allow them to hit homers. There's all sorts of things that can happen. Even if you take Jorge Soler and put him back in the Braves lineup as you did, you would expect better outcomes in the middle of the season. So, I think that's a good point. Where he ends up is going to be a big deal.
How about this? The other player that popped in a big way that we really liked from the postseason, Mark Vientos, had a 29.7% K rate. We were just talking about the volatility of the high K rate players relative to their projections. So yeah, you get some ceiling, but you also get that lower floor. Do you have any reservations about Vientos as a result of the still high K rate in his breakout season? Became a really important piece of that Mets lineup and clearly has game-changing power, but this is a guy that was projected for an 88 WRC plus, and he came in at a 133.
I mean, he does the things we like in terms of 14% barrel rate for Vientos, 113 max EV, 40% pull rate. So it's not quite, he's not like a 50% pull rate guy, 36% fly ball rate. So he's not a 50% fly ball rate guy. Vientos doesn't have the like red flags other than 15.9% swing strike rate, 29.7% strikeout rate. Yeah. Those are pretty big red flags. And I'm going to put Vientos down for like a 235 batting average projection.
Okay, so you're definitely dinging him in that category, which is...
that's probably going to mean that I don't get him.
Yeah, most likely.
But I like him, and, you know, at his age, at 24, you would actually expect a couple years of strikeout rate improvement. So if you could get it down to 28 or 27 even... Maybe you could hit 270, 280 with, you know, it's excellent batted ball oomph. So I do like that part of the package. Defensively, though, you know, he might be headed towards DH.
Which is fine because JD might not be back and they'll have that spot available regardless what they do with Pete Alonso. How about this name, Joey Bart? Pretty nice pickup for the Pirates, a team that has a lot of options to catch, especially with Andy Rodriguez coming back from injury this year. But Rodriguez can play other spots. They've already played Henry Davis some in the outfield. And Bart popped 13 homers in just 282 plate appearances, had the K rate just under 26%, was 21% better than league average, was projected to be 23% worse than league average. It did always feel like expectations on Joey Bart were a little out of bounds, I guess you'd say, in San Francisco, like unfairly high as sort of the
1-1
successor to Buster Posey.
Wasn't he 1-1? No.
1-2. 1-2. But, you know, a guy that was supposed to come in and provide power and be a great defender and just take the mantle from Buster Posey behind the plate. The playing time was always kind of up and down. Had a stretch, I think, in the second half of 22 with the Giants where it looked like he was putting it together, barely played for them in 23. And then finds a new home in Pittsburgh and maybe looks like the guy that people thought he'd be coming out of Georgia Tech now.
Yeah, I wonder. I was there for a lot of the struggle, so some part of me wants to say, it's just 282 plate appearances. You know, he's not that different than what he was before. One thing I can see with Joey Bart, though, is he really changed his chase rate and he just swung less. And I just got finished saying that hitting coaches can affect your swing rates. And swinging less really worked for him in terms of he took most of those when he had a more swinging less philosophy, it came out of the chases, you know. And that really helped his swing strike rate. 10.5% swing strike rate is pretty good, actually. And that's more meaningful in a small sample because he saw a bunch of pitches in 282 plate appearances. So I think he's an interesting second catcher. I don't think I'm willing to give him first catcher status.
I think with Bart, I'd keep my watch list queue going and keep him on the radar as a possible one catcher guy. I think he could be top 12 at the position. I think for now, I'm with you on limiting him to two catcher leagues because there's a lot that could change with his playing time. It's out of his control. But I think he
Andy
did
Rodriguez,
really well.
Henry Davis. I mean, there's other guys around there. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe there's a trade coming that'll open that up or at least alleviate some of those concerns. But Bart really kind of stood out to me as someone that was a lot better than we expected. One more A. There's other players on this list, of course. We're not ignoring Tyler Fitzgerald. We're not ignoring Kerry Carpenter. We're just cherry picking some of the names that really jumped off the page to us. Lawrence Butler. I think you talked in midseason about some adjustments he made. Projected for a 78, finished with a 130 WRC plus, kept the K rate just under 24%. 22 homers and 18 steals with 451 plate appearances. In some ways, to me, this is kind of like the Nolan Jones 2023 season, where you start to tell yourself a story that with a full season in the big leagues, maybe Lawrence Butler's a 30 homer, 25 steal type player. and maybe less of a batting average liability than Nolan Jones because of the adjustments that he made this year. Surprisingly to me, in the early drafts, you're actually able to get Lawrence Butler outside the top 100 overall. So you're not quite paying 2024 draft day Nolan Jones prices to get Lawrence Butler, at least not yet.
The weird thing about him is if you look at I like to do these rolling graphs on Fangraphs, and one of my favorites is just to put on chase rate, swing percentage versus WOBA, and you can very clearly see that early in 2024, Lawrence Butler was chasing a lot as and the sort of physical manifestation of this cue was for him to keep his head still, and that allowed him to see the pitch better. That allowed him to reduce his chase rate, and that was the first sort of white hot peak where I think he had 3 homers in a game in Philadelphia and all this stuff. Then he started to come down off of that peak. I talked to him about, well, now that you've proved that you can be on the heater, they're going to fill you up, in the zone with pitches down and breaking pitches and stuff like that. And that's literally what they did. And he responded by having like a hit streak. He had like a 20-game hit streak. And again, you see a little bit of rise in chase rate. And then as that reduces, a big WOBA spike. The only thing that's a little bit worrisome is he had a third chase rate peak late last year at the end of the season, and his WOBA was going down. So I see a pretty wide oscillation in chase rates where he's spending time at 40% chase rates and at 25% chase rates. That's a big difference. And so if I'm at all worried about him, it's that he's way streakier than you'd expect from a guy with a 24% strikeout rate. It looks a little bit more like a 30% strikeout rate guy. So I don't know. I think he's probably a 24% strikeout rate guy, but maybe he's always going to be streaky. And if a guy's always going to be streaky, there's always a chance you just get the bad streak for more than, a half the season. It's a terrible season.
The would you rather in this case, based on current ADPs, is Lawrence Butler versus Cody Bellinger for 2025.
You know what? I think I'm taking the young guy. I just don't like with Cody Bellinger at 29 the fact that he doesn't seem like he's ever going to get back to a plus barrel rate. And he only stole 9 bases this year. Do we think he's like really likely to get back to 20 stolen bases next year? So I'm going to take Lawrence Butler because I think Lawrence Butler is going to steal more bases. I think he's going to hit more homers. And the strikeout rate, batting average part of it is a little bit of an unknown, but not necessarily terrible for Butler,
Right. And we've seen some amazingly low floors from Bellinger in that category. Major shoulder injuries may have been a factor, but still, I think it's still an unknown. Like what the projections spit out for Cody Bellinger and how much I trust it is probably as wide a gap as you're going to find for a lot of players. It's a lot of questions for me. I'm like, man, I don't know what to make of this guy. And it seems like he continues to change. And in some ways it's like prolonging his career as a good above average player. And in other ways, it's maybe doing that without having the ceiling that we saw 3, 4, 5, like more like 5 years ago now. That's been the frustrating
remember when he
part.
broke into the league with 27% strikeout rate and 39 homers? That seems like so long ago.
Remember when he hit 47 homers with a 16.4% strikeout rate? Like that's bananas. He stole 15 bases that year, and that's when stolen bases weren't free.
Yeah.
It's hard to steal 15 bases when you hit 47 homers.
But now he's just kind of a limp noodle, low strikeout rate guy.
But he had a 136 WRC plus in 2023, hit 307, popped 26 homers, and stole 20 bases. I think they could both end up being good players at cost, but if you have to make the choice, you can only get one. I think I'm with you on Butler, but I'm not quite as dismissive of Bellinger, even though it's been a lot of question marks and a meandering road up to this point in his career. He's still just 29, man. He's not that old.
That's true, but part of the story in the 26-20 season in 2023 for Bellinger was that he figured out his 2-strike approach, and I was like, dude, that's I don't know. That felt like grasping at straws. Like,
let's just do it again. Like keep doing it. If it's real, like keep doing it.
He hit 260 in 2 strike counts. Well, the league hits like 160. So which number do you think is going to continue?
Now, more to come on Bellinger, I'm sure, as time goes, and more to come on some of the hitters that missed their projections as we get to position reviews in a few weeks and eventually position previews at a couple of months beyond that, because there are plenty of other interesting names to cover. But we are out of time for today. As I mentioned up top, if you want to join the Discord, you can do that with the link in the show description. Find Eno on Twitter at Eno Saris. Find me at Derek Van Riper. Find the pod at Rates and Barrels. That's going to do it for this episode of Rates and Barrels. We're back with you on Thursday.
Thanks for listening.